is the ideal rule that governs the physical world around us. Form follows function. This is a design principle one-on-one. And so the chair that you're sitting on, the shoes that you're wearing are looking like that because first and foremost, they have a function. And the form should follow that function. That's all very well. But there's another rule that actually trumps this. And I'm deducing that into its very essence. This is Robert Solow's growth function from 1958. It's in fact what governs everything around us to date, the GDP function. And so while you have a designer that has a dream and that has a function to think about and wants to create a cool form around that function, you have an investor on the other side, the capitalist that holds the capital, that gets the final say. So there's this first power relationship between the designer and the investor. And I find that dichotomy really interesting. And as a political economist, this is the formula that I've studied at business school. Y is GDP, and it's a function of K, capital, L, labor, and A is this variable that encapsulates innovation, technology, and I don't really get to meddle with that. I've been trained how to optimize capital, how to optimize labor, but this technology aspect is something that is supposed and assumed to be given by us by the engineer in the lab. And I think we can all agree after this week that something fundamental is happening with the division of labor. It's sort of becoming very enmeshed, and we all can start to develop the technologies. And I think this is why a lot of our politicians and economists are surprised by the exponential nature of technology, because they just don't look at that as a variable. Oh, thank you. Sure. We had a bit of a struggle. I have very large hair, but the smallest head on earth. So, is this good? It also much better for me. Thank you. Yeah. So this is in fact what governs everything around it, including the physical nature. And we've seen impressive GDP growth. Let me just start with Industry 0.0. We sort of had to go back from scratch. And my research focused on what is the fundamental of production. And I would take that into three pillars. First, we extract raw material, we process it, and then we consume it. These three pillars have stayed true throughout time. And so what is the role of technology in driving increased GDP? We have Industry 1.0. This is really where we start seeing the very first of immense and incredible GDP growth, because this is the first time in history with the steam revolution, with the steam engine, that we're able to physically separate these three pillars. So we can extract raw material from one space on the planet, we can process it somewhere else, and we can transport it and consume it somewhere else in the world. So this is the first time that we're seeing a physical separation of these three pillars. And it's enabled even further with the second industrial revolution. And there we start to separate these pillars even further. We start to electrify the factory, which enables actually more and more factories around the world. Before, the steam engine was in the factory, and that was very expensive to do manufacturing. So only a couple of few could do that. So with the electrification of the factory, of all the engines that drove manufacturing, we can have more players that were part of the global value chain of production. And so extraction was, again, somewhere else in the world. We could transport it. Electrification also had an impact on the communication, our ability to control space and actually start calling another place in the world and saying, hey, when is my raw material coming? So we could plan the supply chain more in depth. And so processing was chopped up into manufacturing one place, assembly a totally different place, and even consumption another place. And we see all these new different activities that defines the global value chain of production. So it's getting more and more complicated with technology. That's basically the essence. And when Industry 3.0 came, it became really complicated, very networked value chain of production, and increasingly separating where we take raw material, where we manufacture it, and where we consume it. So we've seen really, I think this is probably the better value chain of production. If we add a y-axis, we can actually start to see where do we place these activities globally. And here is where it's interesting from a power perspective. Who gets to place the most profit savvy, the ones with the highest margin activities? And in fact, we're seeing that R&D, marketing, retail, sales at the end of this value chain is being placed in economies that are very developed. And raw material, manufacturing, assembly are low value-added activities that we place somewhere else in developing economies. This was now called the smiling curve of economics that was invented by the CEO of Intel in the 90s, because he saw that when he looked at his product, he could see that it was very evident where he produced the stuff in the US versus where he got stuff imported from China and everywhere else in the world. We've seen impressive GDP growth throughout these different industrial revolutions. McKinsey assumes that we're just seeing the cusp of the GDP growth. And we can just only by the digital age onward expect trillions and trillions being fueled into the global economy. And all of that is fine. But how is it distributed? Thomas Piketty made a fair argument that yes, GDP growth has been exponential, but it's also exponentially unfairly distributed, and social inequality is rising. Or what about this one, which we've been discussing a lot this week? I think this is a bunch of exponential graphs that you cannot look at hard enough. You can simply, as Nick Hahn said, you cannot look at them enough. Victor Nollet in 2016 published a book, Educating for Sustainability, where he revealed the exponential decay, the other side of the coin, exponential decay of global production. And here you can see from the start of 1750 up until now, throughout our different industrial revolutions, our exponential decay in global biodiversity, the ecosystems, amount of domesticated land. Ocean ecosystems are being decayed and exploited. Ozone depletion, the list goes on and on. And so we have a chance to really reinvent going forward. Yes, Christian?
If you want questions now instead of later, but I was just curious as to the inequality or the increase in inequality. Is it simply due to the fact that they're following their own exponential trajectories and therefore starting at a lower point? It's really a natural increase in inequality, given that they're both on the same exponential trajectory, or is it actually increasing more than that?
If we're seeing rising social inequalities?
Yeah, if you can go back to the other slide.
Yeah.
That given that they are at different starting points, they must necessarily have an increased inequality because they're both following an exponential trajectory.
Yeah.
So that's inherent in the function of an exponential function, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure exactly what the square variable here is, but yeah. The major shift that we've seen from the 90s is that on the global scale, we went from valuing GDP per capita, which was a fair variable to look at in terms of actually being able to track inequality. But then somewhere the economists agreed that we should look at the nominal GDP growth because per capita is simply too depressing, which is sort of, yeah. That's another side of the discussion. So when looking at these other side of the coin of exponential growth, which I'm interested in, my main hypothesis and assumption is, what if how we've separated global production, extraction, processing, and consumption so much that is it true, out of sight, out of mind? And is there potential now to start rethinking production, go back to being aware and responsible of how we consume, where it comes from? And maybe we should actually make production much more visible. And that's what drives me into 3D printing. There's a bunch of ways that you can start to engage in 3D printing, and I'm going to share my story. It relates to corporate innovation, and then after that I'll share some of the major paradigm shifts that you can take with you if you also want to engage in 3D printing. But so with this hypothesis, for me at least, I wanted to work in some of the, let's say, maybe blockers of change, or let's say enablers of this out of sight, out of mind kind of production that we've seen before. Maersk Line. I started in Maersk back in 2010, worked there for 4 years. I applied with the sole goal of disrupting them from within. I didn't tell that in my job application. But they are enablers, making the production invisible. Their core is to make trade so seamless and invisible as possible, so that you get all of your products nice and neat packaged. And this is something I think is problematic. So I started to work at what literally fuels Maersk. It's the engine. This is a rtha Flex 96 two-stroke Wärtsilä designed engine. Yes! That powers this Emma vessel that I showed earlier. And I worked with procuring parts for this engine for about 4 years. And my assumption was, wait, why has this engine looked exactly the same for the past almost 100 years? So I came in as a really annoying political economist for the site and said, what about 3D printing? So that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to introduce 3D printing into the maritime industry, and at that point nobody had heard about it. So I had a hackathon where I invited local makers. I gave them some files of the engine parts, and I said, hack away. So that's the first step. This is some maybe historical footage from the hackathon, the first time sort of Maersk gets to know 3D printing. You see they come with their own homemade 3D printers. And I had bought them nothing more than sandwiches and coffee, but they literally all showed up with their printers. Pretty cool to see. My manager standing there with his back against the camera now. He's very suspicious. He doesn't want to touch the part. He gets to do that later, I promise. And then the next step was to actually educate the industry. So make a little PR branding stunt. And I'll show just a little footage of that. Can we get some sound, please? Okay, it's me, so I can say it. So how 3D printing works is that it's layer, layer, layer. You have a nozzle that makes the plastic soft, and it solidifies, and then you have the part. Voila. That was basically what the video said. And I also said something about how metal 3D printing works. Basically, I had to educate the industry for how 3D printing worked. And my idea here was, what if we put 3D printers on board the vessels, and we can print our parts as we need them? This was just an idea. And the printer that I'm standing in front of was not ours. So I had knocked the door on Louis Paulson and said, can we sort of borrow to make a PR stunt? So at that point, no investments, and we actually got quite some attention. This is my debut as public speaker back in 2014. I was so scared. I was invited for the World Shipping Forum Summit in China, talking about 3D printing. I was like the expert in that industry as a political economist. It's expertise, it's relative, let's say that. And then we got nominated to an innovation award. Again, it was only an idea. For me, corporate innovation is about being able to leapfrog a lot of noise. And in fact, I started out being enemies with Maersk and wanted to disrupt them from within. Now I owe them everything, because they gave me the space. Sure, I did a couple of moves that maybe weren't sort of politically correct without asking for permission, but they provided a platform on which I could actually have a big impact. And since the maritime industry has embraced 3D printing, Port of Rotterdam has now installed large-scale metal 3D printers that are amongst the biggest metal parts coming out is actually now from the maritime industry. And Maersk has moved on to apply drones to 3D printing, so there's a lot of ripple effects. And for me, the essence is to look at not only what 3D printing can do for you, but with your unique way of thinking, what can you do for 3D printing by applying your unique way of thinking? And so for that, some couple of basics as to what it is. First 3D printer, $200,000, super expensive from 83. So at one point, the computer that we saw, the Moore's Law, was good enough to power another technology, 3D printing, and since plummeted in price, and also super intuitive. So the software is integrated, a kid can start working with 3D printers. If you're a bit more tech savvy, you can actually build your own 3D printer. This is the rtha project, an open source 3D printer project, that actually you can 3D print 85% of the next printer. So here you see the parent 3D printer and the child 3D printer. So they can sort of self-replicate each other. Basically, more than 250 materials. I cannot keep track of the innovation within material science, but it's definitely exponential. 10 times increased in price, 100 times. I even saw 1,000 times. Last week there was a new 3D printing technology that came out, which is a hologram lens. It's basically taking a picture of a fluid and then you get your part. So it's quite interesting. Again, the software more intuitive, drag and drop. And yeah, more than 10 open source design platforms where you can literally download a part for free and get a printer somewhere. General Electric is one of the major investors. This is a metal 3D printer. It uses a laser instead of this nozzle function that I showed before. Here they print several different parts in one bed. So 3D printers don't understand the cost of complexity. Complexity is free. Everything is controlled digitally. So if they print 10 of the same part or 10 different parts, doesn't matter. And so their fuel nozzle is one of the most famous cases that goes into their jet engines and was mass produced last year. So maybe you've been flying with metal 3D printed part. And this is 75% lighter, 5 times stronger than the original part. And it's 19 parts that previously were assembled that are now manufactured in one. Even more so, the material waste is cut by almost 90%. So the CEO of General Electric says that by 2020, he's going to have 30% of all the parts 3D printed that goes onto the aviation industry. So sort of major investments. BMW and Airbus have gone together to print this neat motorcycle. It would work well for me, I think. 35 kilos. The chassis alone is 6 kilos, so the entire motorcycle is only 35 kilos, and it accelerates up to 130 kilometers an hour. Basically, this is what they teach in business school, that when you are a manufacturer, you need to have high quantity of products in order to have a positive return of investment, right? So the more parts you produce, your costs go down. But with 3D printing, stays stable. So the 3D printed line here, the red one, is basically same investment, irregardless of what you're printing. So mass customization is a huge thing. And implants, the hospital, the healthcare industry, it's huge to have mass customization. And it's not only the sort of high-scale investors. We can also, again, as I mentioned, a kid can design their own prosthetic hand. This is the RoboHand, which is the most downloaded file on Thingiverse. Thingiverse is sort of the library for designs. And he can just choose his own design, own colors. What's better is that he keeps growing. So he needs new prosthetic hands. And one that was traditionally manufactured for him would cost $1,000 and now just a couple of hundred, not even. Yes, Christian.
I was just curious to the cost per unit, because I have seen some projects focusing very much on the or upcycling of materials for 3D, because I guess it would make obvious sense to start using also metals and usable plastics for it. But is that something happening and also decreasing the price per unit even further?
Yeah. I'm not saying that I'm going to cover all the topics in my talk. It's kind of hard, but I am going to cover that. So maybe we should actually park the questions until last and see what I didn't cover at the end, because I hope I'll cover a bit of that. And so basically this is what I learned, that industrial manufacturing is something that is in that quadrant. High exit barrier, high entry barriers, really expensive, only for the few with a lot of capital that can start becoming a manufacturer. But we're obviously seeing quite of a different nature. Because it's additive and not subtractive, you save a lot of material costs. Because you deal with economies of scope, not scale, so in fact, you get a higher return on investment the more different your parts are, and the more indifferent you are to producing the same quantities. Yeah, we're moving probably, hopefully, from mass production towards mass customization, that we can customize for your individual need, my shoes for me because my foot is unique. And we're probably going to move from supply chain management over to demand management. That becomes more important. As we move closer to the customer, we need to be aware of what are their unique needs. So that becomes one of the major paradigm shifts with digital manufacturing. If you want to engage with 3D printing, this is the Airbnb for 3D printers called 3D Hubs. In Copenhagen, there's about 1,000 hubs, more or less. You can go in and download your file on Thingiverse and send it out to your network around you. And they'll go back with sort of quotations. I can have it 3D printed within 2 days, this color, this cost, so on. And even more, you can sort of get to know your local makers. It's quite cool. Go home to them and see actually your parts being printed. And 3D Hubs is a global network again. And we're seeing printers in the most wacky places, like I don't even know where that is, but I mean, it's really spreading out and getting to some really, really remote areas. And that is important because when you have an earthquake in Nepal, you need to get up some kind of production system right away. Field Ready is a company that goes out to disaster areas and educates the local population for how to use 3D printers. To print water seals for the water pipe that broke, or even more sanitary umbilical cord structures. So there was a pregnant woman after the earthquake in Nepal that needed to give birth, and you try to bootstrap everything you have around you, and it's not sanitary. So here you can just 3D print something that is much more sanitary, and that is good enough. And this good enough concept is also going to be really important. I met sort of my soul person, I feel, a couple of weeks ago, Hans Fouché in South Africa. He is one of the experts in what is it that is just good enough? It doesn't have to look perfect. It can look scruffy. But in South Africa, where my needs are totally different as to how they are in Sweden, where I'm coming from, the good enough concept is fine. And so he developed this huge 3D printer. It's the largest I've ever seen, 4 by 4 meters, where he also used recycled plastics to 3D print stuff. He tells me now about a car wrench. Can we not at all have sound to this? No sound. Okay. Well, he has this most, South African accent is very charming. And he explains the car wrench, which he printed on his printer. And it's in plastics. But for him, it's good enough. It's good enough out in the savannah to have this plastic car wrench that he 3D printed. And we talked a little bit, that's what you mentioned, Christian. I think we're going to see a lot within using with the material that you have locally. So we see a lot of projects around using plastic ocean waste and 3D printing with that, making filament. Closed loop system. Ecosystem here is will.i.am's will.i.am, the singer, his own pet project. He works with 3D systems to make a closed loop production system. So you can take a pet bottle, put it back into the 3D printer. If you have a kid with sort of plastic sandals and then the kid grows, you just go in and you extend 1 centimeter, you take the old shoe in, you take a plastic bottle, and then voila, the new shoe. So thinking about these as closed loop production systems. Adidas is taking a big leap as well. Some of their products, in fact, are going to be 3D printed. This is one of the shoes that came out last year, limited quantity, but they take ocean waste and want to 3D print with it as well. So some of the major paradigm shift is what happens with innovation when you decentralize a production system, or when you move from a B2B model over to a C2C model, consumer to consumer, or even more provocative, consumer to business. That's exactly what happened when I worked at Maersk, that I just took a private person helping me as a big business to innovate. And what happens with this local good enough? I think that's going to be one of the major paradigm shifts as well. A lot of innovation from that. And hopefully moving from a very linear production value chain to something more circular. And when that happens, when we have additive, when we have new complexities and innovation in materials, what can we now produce? And this is really the most mind-breaking exercise, I think. This is natural resources that 3D print with meteorites that fell on Earth 2 years ago in Argentina. And they took a meteorite, grinded it down, and used the material to print a part that goes into a space rocket. And obviously they need this because when they colonize space, they're going to have to use the material that is out there, not transport it from Earth. So, and what about when we can start to digitally control not only micro, but nano? So the cross between 3D printing and nanotechnology, this is a structure printed on a hair straw. And what if when we combine 3D printing with artificial intelligence to produce structures that we cannot even fathom, with different complexities, different strengths? This is AI builds that use machine learning to optimize the production process, but to also produce these lightweight structures that are much stronger than the other ones. And 4D printing, 3D printing is like almost so last year. And 4D printing, what if you can now actually control how your material evolves with time? So previously we've designed every part around us to withstand time. But now that we know how materials corrode and so on, why don't we just program it accordingly? And when we know how plastics evolve with water, for example, why shouldn't we design it accordingly? And so here is a self-assembled cube that they developed out of MIT to actually work with the fourth dimension, namely time. So self-assembly. This is the only concept. No, I have another one, model showing you. A water pipe that contracts when it's little water running through the system, or that expands when there's a lot of water running through the system. Or even better, can somehow help the water run through the system. Mind-boggling. So we're not only dealing with micro, we're also dealing with nano. It's not only normal materials, it's alien materials. And we have to start thinking in terms of systems, not just the strength, but start to build just like nature builds, layer by layer by layer. And we're going to see a lot within learning from nature, in fact, because nature is perfect, right? And that's what fuels a lot within four-dimensional printing, that we can start understanding how does nature build materials that actually lives in harmony with time. So we have a huge opportunity. When we say Industry 4.0, how do you want it to look? This is how 3.0, that's the value chain that's been given to us. How do you want it to look? I've revealed where my biases is, and if I haven't made the case even clearer, I'm going to do it now. This is just some data on the waste in the EU. 2,598 million tons of waste, and it's from our economic activity. So both construction, mining, manufacturing. And 3D printing can touch in all of these areas. Because if we use less material, we need to mine less. If we use less material in our constructions, less material waste as well. If it's additive and not subtractive, less waste. What does these 2,598 million tons mean? Like, what I can't really fathom. Let's bring back the vessel, Emma Maersk. So it's about 14,700 Emma Maersk vessels a year. 40 Emma vessels a day. That's how much waste in the EU alone. It's very untransparent for how it is globally, but I can only assume that it's not a nice picture. So circular production is hopefully something that you want to take part in developing and supporting. But what if this circle could also do something for social inequality? What if it also could have a symbol for an engaged dialogue about the physical world around us? Form follows function, a dialogue between the engineer or the designer. But what if you got to decide? What if you got to decide the chair that you're sitting in, the buildings around you? What if even all of the physical stuff around you affects the way you think, the way you are, more than you've thought before? And if you think that, maybe you want to decide. Or else our buildings are going to look exactly like this. 3D printed 10 houses in 48 hours in China. That's very nice. But they look exactly the same as they've done for the past, 200 years, more. So we need to start thinking totally differently. And how would this affect how we are, our identity, what creative thoughts we have? Vincent Cabello, a Belgian architect that has designed ocean skyscrapers that he thinks we could have 3D printed in 2049 by using only plastic waste. And we would be living down in the ocean, we would be living with our killer whales. And how would that impact the way you are and what creative thoughts you have and what defines you as humans? Thank you.